Good day, radio listeners. Welcome to this edition of the Pure Sex Radio broadcast. We're glad to have you with us. My name is Jonathan, and we've got back with us a familiar face and guest. We have Gigi Hopkins with us. She is our Wives Care Coordinator, and I am going to actually let you, Gigi, introduce even another special guest that we have on the line with us. So why don't you introduce our special guest this week? Sure.
It's my great pleasure to introduce Ronnie West. Ronnie has been just a sweet friend, and I was, even before the podcast here, I went and looked at our first correspondence, and we're going to be almost 4 years into this friendship, which is awesome.
Wow, that is great.
Right? And her husband attended the Gateway to Freedom, and that's how we got connected. And a friendship just flourished out of that. And little did I know that God was also giving me a ministry partner for the Wives Care groups and ministry. So Ronnie has joined me from the beginning when we started the Wives Care groups. And she's been just... I was thinking of a couple of letters after her name that I could give her. WW would be wise woman.
There you go. Nice. I like that. Well, Ronnie, welcome to the program.
My pleasure to be with you all today.
Yeah, we're looking forward to just having a great conversation. Before we dive into kind of addressing this issue of boundaries, because I think that's a really important issue, especially as we're talking about wives that are seeking to heal from betrayal and those kind of things. How do you establish healthy boundaries? I want to put a plug out there first for the next Wives Care groups that are coming up. There's still a few spots left, and it's going to be coming up this next week from when this is airing. So why don't you ladies who facilitate these groups take just maybe a minute or two to describe what that is and how ladies can get plugged into one of those groups?
Sure. Thanks, Jonathan. This is a way to dive in to some good healing, get familiar with some good guardrails is what we call, right? For a smooth road to healing, as for a wife who's been hurt by her husband's sexual brokenness. And we do that. It's super easy to connect. It's online. So from the comfort of your home, some women find the comfort of their car to be the place to join us. And we only require 1 hour, although I'm there before and after for Q&A and all. So we'd love to have you join us. It's so important to get out of isolation in order to heal well.
And Ronnie, what would you say about just kind of the dynamic and just the benefit of these online care groups for the wives that participate?
I'd have to say there's a couple things that stand out in my mind, and the first one is that our focus is really true to our name, Wives Care, and wives need a lot of support as they work through their own journey. Mm-hmm. And number two, I'd have to say that we have wives that join us in all different stages of their pain. And it's really beautiful to see the transformation that happens in that 6-week time period. Now, I'm not saying that we're happily ever after by the end of 6 weeks, but I'm saying that the tools and these guardrails that Gigi mentioned really bring about change in their lives. And not only that, but we learn a lot from each other in our time of sharing, and it's really a wonderful time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and while, again, I know this is still kind of before we get to the specific topic this week, but because I still want to kind of further introduce Ronnie just a little bit, I mean, you mentioned that, Ronnie's husband had gone to Gateway and this. Ronnie, can you give us just a little bit more of your story, just so our listeners can be a little more familiar with you? They're pretty familiar now with Gigi. I mean,
Yes.
she's been around here a little while, but why don't you just give a little bit more of just kind of your background that got you to this point where you now find yourself wanting to serve and help wives?
Sure. My husband brought home a packet of information from the Gateway that was designed, specifically for the wives. And inside that packet was a bookmark, and I still have that bookmark. It's a treasure to me, and it was a gift from Gigi. And she just said, "If you need anything, I'm available." And I thought, you know what? I'm going to take advantage of that. And so I remember calling and leaving a message on her answering machine. And within a couple hours, she called me back. And we just had such a beautiful conversation. It was wonderful to know that there was somebody that understood where I was at, having experienced, having her own story. And so that started a friendship, but also just somebody to walk alongside of me as I was going through my pain with my husband's own sexual brokenness. And so as we begin to talk together, pray together, even spend some time together through the years, and the Wives Care program coming into existence, being a part of that program helped me individually in my own journey, and just seeing how much wives need to know that they're not alone. And that although all of our stories are different and unique, they all have similar threads that are woven through them. Mm-hmm. And to be able to connect with other women is helpful, but it's also just having that kind of support has helped me individually, and in turn wanting to reach out to other women to give hope.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's wonderful, and that's exactly the kind of that's what we hope for when people are coming through our ministry and seeking help. Is we want that. Ideally, we want that full circle to happen, which is, hey, we recognize the things that need healing in our own lives, and we go through that process of healing, and then realize, wow, now I have something of value to offer to somebody else because I've been through this process. And it's so wonderful to see when the Lord prompts a person's heart to then seek to give that away. It's a beautiful thing. So we appreciate you, Ronnie, for kind of answering that call and letting God use you in that way. So thank you for doing that.
So agree.
And it's been a blessing, a great blessing to me.
Okay, Gigi, so I want you to set the stage now for our listeners of where we're going to take the rest of this podcast in terms of dealing with this issue of boundaries, because I think this is one of those issues that is absolutely critical, really kind of overall in recovery across the board, whether it's the person who's the offender or the one who's offended. But I also think this is one of those areas that is ripe for a lot of misinterpretation and abuse. So I would love for you ladies to kind of help set the record straight for how boundaries, what they are, and then how they can most effectively be administered in a woman's healing journey.
Right. And this is, I would say that's a big topic too, right?
Oh, yeah.
It seems like all topics here that we
Absolutely.
come across are big. But so we have a few notes here that we wanted to kind of follow. And the first thing that we start with is just really trying to figure out what boundaries is not. Exactly because of what you said, Jonathan, that there's so much abuse and misunderstanding.
Yeah.
And it at the end it can create even more pressure for someone who is in healing to perform things that they're not ready for, So we wanted to make it simple. And starting out, we said here that boundaries are not something that we do or try to do to another person. It's not like we're trying to make rules for others to follow, right? Which is, that would be an aspect of control.
Yeah,
if
that's
you're
manipulating, right? Yeah.
manipulating, controlling. And I have to be very honest, Ron, you would agree with me. There's a level that wives, when, especially in the beginning when they're in trauma, they may do that, you know?
It's a defense mechanism, right? I mean, your life has just been ripped to shreds. Of course, you're going to have a natural tendency to then try to make everything fit and work again.
Yes, your life has been turned upside down. Your emotions are all over the place, and you may say things one day, say another thing another day, you know. So there is, we need to give a lot of room here for figuring out how to act in this situation, right? So that's a really important part that we want to emphasize, is that boundaries is really not about you coming up with rules to control another person, but it's figuring out, and that takes time and self-awareness oftentimes, and sometimes it's just something very intuitive, but figuring out what you need, what you want, what is necessary for you to be able to have, you know, the safety and sanity that you need to keep living your life to the best of your ability, right? What would you say, Ronnie?
Oh, I totally agree with you, Gigi. And I think sometimes we think that the boundary needs to look a certain way, just like a clear fence line. And it takes a lot of self-awareness, practice, self-examination to figure out what it is we're needing. And sometimes the boundary can be something as simple as, this isn't working for me, I need thus and so. And we need time to be able to even determine that. But I think one of the most important aspects of boundaries is that motive is everything. And constantly reevaluating what's my motive behind, you know, whatever limit I'm trying to set. And that's something that's taken me quite a few years to learn.
Yeah, so in that regard, thinking of our listeners, I can imagine that right now some of them are saying, well, okay, then what are the good motives then behind that? And I think also with that, then being able to say, if boundaries are not about trying to set controls and manipulate the other person, then what are boundaries? I mean, like, what are they actually? And then how do you develop those positive motives, or the right kind of motives for establishing boundaries?
Mm-hmm. Good question, Jonathan.
Let me jump in there, Gigi.
Sure.
I think that sometimes when we're going, and as Gigi said, especially in the beginning, we want the apple cart, you know, this big explosion that's happened. We want to put everything back in order as fast as possible. And we want our lives, quote, back to normal, when normal really wasn't working for us. Right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're having to look at ourselves, and I think very often the focus will be on the offender. Okay, so if you do this or continue to do this, then I'm going to do this. And my husband had a great term for that. He called it the punishment box. Mm-hmm. So if I act out, okay, then I go in the penalty box. When the reality I came to realize was, it's not the penalty box, it's the protect my heart box. Mm-hmm. I can't do this anymore just like this. So I'm going to need to see some positive progress in a certain direction for me to be able to commit to, I keep moving forward with you. And it's not just because you've erred, it's because I can't take this kind of pain on a repeated basis. Mm-hmm. And therefore I've had to set certain limits.
Okay, yeah. What would you say, Gigi, about just trying to define boundaries in a very simple way to help the women out there know what we're talking about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think if you put it very simply, boundaries is about finding your voice and finding what your needs are, and then finding a way to express that, right?
Yes.
So it's really not, like we said, about making rules for others, but it's really figuring out what is it in my heart needs in order to heal. I'll give you an example of something that, and I even thought about a term that might be helpful in terms of setting intuitive boundaries, right? Things that are just in your heart. Each person is different. Each reality is different. Each, couple's dynamic is different, right? So no one is in your shoes except for you and Jesus
Right.
to really get you, right? So I think it's really important to connect with who you are and how God is leading you to take a stand,
Right.
so that you can move forward, right?
Well, yeah,
So-
and can I push back on that a little bit, only for
Okay.
clarity's sake?
Okay.
And the reason I wanted to ask this, and maybe both of you guys can have input on this, is because you guys have both been through this process, and there is a level of I think weight and brokenness to that initial discovery of the betrayal and those kinds of things. That don't you also think, though, it's important that in that season of sort of kind of trying to know yourself, and if I can put it in these terms, discover yourself and kind of where those limits are, that it's probably very helpful to have some wise outside perspective because you're such a mess emotionally at that time. So how do you sort of, because it seems to me like there's kind of needs to be a balance there of, yes, there's a personal journey of you kind of assessing internally where some of those maybe limits and protective walls need to be. But at the same time, doesn't it also benefit you to have somebody that's maybe in a little bit more stable, another woman in a more stable position emotionally, to speak into that to help you discover that as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I was going to give you an example of something,
Okay.
which is, I think, my first day in dealing with my husband's secret, as well as dealing with my healing journey, right? I just had an immediate response, and I think it came from the Lord leading me, right? In our case, we were in full-time ministry, serving abroad, right? And I've just came to an awareness of my husband's sexual brokenness, and it was a dark, hard thing to face, right? Well, I kid you not, I had not listened to a Pure Sex Radio broadcast. I had not read a book. I had not counseled with a therapist or anybody. I had this instant boundary that God gave me, and I shared with my husband. I told him, listen, I do not feel comfortable in any way, shape, or form to continue in ministry unless you're willing to go and speak with someone who has authority over our destiny, who could say, you need to go home, you can't do this. I needed that support. That was an instinctive thing. So
yeah, and I don't want to make any kind of statement that makes it seem as if the Holy Spirit Himself cannot intercede directly and speak to you. But I think we all agree it's never just a singular avenue that leads to healing. I mean, you both have experienced that yes, there's the direct intervention of the Holy Spirit, and then there's other wise people in your life, and then there's just the discernment and abilities that God's given you in your own personality and mind, and all those things mixed together. So, Ronnie, what would you say in terms of that process of being able to get that discernment, to be able to know where some of those lines need to be for your own personal health and growth in this process?
Well, prayer is a big part of trying to figure out what our needs are, where we're going, what to do. And I think, one thing that we have to be careful of, and it is very important to get support and wise counsel from other people, because you're, especially in the beginning, it's like you can't think straight. And so, but we also have to let the Holy Spirit lead us, because there's a lot of information out there now, and you can pick up a book and say, it can say, okay, if you're in the beginning stages of this, you need to do numbers 1 through 10, set these boundaries, and sometimes we have a hard time just getting through step 1 of getting up in the day and facing the day. So I think that that constant trying to figure out what is it that I need. And sometimes our husbands are not going to be able to provide that for us. And I think the willingness to be open and flexible, because sometimes we might set a boundary and we actually follow through on, okay, if this happens, then I'm going to do this. And then the Lord may say, okay, that's reevaluate. And sometimes a boundary is just allowing for a space to reexamine and look at the situation and have time to have grace for yourself to figure things out.
Right.
So, as you can tell, boundaries, it's not an easy, clear-cut A plus B is always going to equal C.
Right.
It'd be nice if it was that way.
And that's what I appreciate about what you all are saying is obviously there's some clarity to the definition of just the simplicity of realizing this, and there's boundaries simply mean to put a limit on something, right? Mm-hmm. It's essentially saying I'm drawing a line here or putting a wall that says I'm either not going to cross that wall or I'm not going to allow anybody to cross that wall. It's just setting that limit. But the other thing that I like what you're doing is you're letting people realize that this is so much of a personal kind of journey about your internal growth than it is about trying to just be prescriptive to a process. In other words, just being, like you said, 1 through 10, just do this, this. Because, again, every person is different. But I also think it's important to recognize, and you guys have essentially stated this, there are still foundational principles that are at play in this that are timeless and unchanging, and they're based on God's Word and those kinds of things that can give great direction even on that very personalized journey. So let's look at one of the things that you have down here that I really liked on the notes is that healthy boundaries comes from a heart conviction and not from imposition or pressure from others. So how can a woman begin to establish these kind of boundaries when she's probably in a very frail state emotionally? Because boundaries seem to take a lot of courage and strength. So how can you encourage the women out there that are feeling like, hey, I just found out a week ago that my husband's been looking at porn for 20 years. And I'm feeling in a very vulnerable, weak, scared, panicky state. And I'm hearing this great news about boundaries, and it seems like the thing that I need to do. But it also seems like I don't feel like I can stand. I mean, I don't feel like I've got the emotional strength to stand. How would you encourage that woman to not only discover where those lines maybe need to be for her, but then to actually have the confidence and the courage to stand in those boundaries?
Well, I'm sure Ronnie has some good tips here too, but I think Ronnie mentioned prayer. Good counsel can help with that, right? Also, not feeling the pressure that you have to do something immediately, giving yourself time and space to, get the support and the insight and understanding that you will need. And if you don't feel like you have the emotional stamina, don't.
Yeah.
Honor yourself, because part of boundaries is learning how to have a voice and how to honor where you're at.
Yeah.
So, and that's where I think it really becomes unhealthy to let what what's working for other people become your boundary book, or
Well, that's even one of the things you guys have down here is that God has given each of us a different measure of faith.
yes,
So even in that, we've got to recognize we've got different maybe limitations, even just in our own body physically and emotionally and spiritually, and that's okay. I love the way you phrase that, Gigi, to honor yourself. A lot of this sounds to me like it's simply bringing back the intrinsic dignity
yes,
that God has already placed in you as a woman made in His image.
right.
And so I love the way you phrase that, to honor yourself in that.
Yeah, another way we put that, Jonathan, is that, a wife in this situation, she's been violated deeply and very, hugely. And I think she doesn't do herself any service in violating herself because of so-and-so saying this, or this recovery program says we have to do this.
Right, exactly.
And she might just continue that pattern if erring on the other side. So.
Now, Ronnie, we just have a few minutes left, but I would love for you to respond to this one of the next statements that you have here, and that is that a wife must give herself grace to figure out how to best stand up for her needs in a broken marriage. So, what does that look like, maybe on a practical level, to give herself grace as she learns to stand?
I think grace is the key word there, and that you have to be willing to be vulnerable to even make a mistake. And that even trying to set boundaries, it's not going to always look perfectly, come out perfectly. And just the whole aspect of allow yourself room to learn and grow. And I think it takes a lot of courage to reach out and to not stay isolated. Sometimes we want to do that. It feels comfortable to just shut everything out. But being brave enough to reach out, and even we've had some wives that have joined the group in the past that haven't felt like that they were at a point to even be able to participate a lot. But just by being there and listening, they've learned a lot, they've grown, and I think just having an attitude of, this is going to be a messy road, I'm going to do the best I can, and be kind to myself.
And Gigi, I've just kind of as we begin to wrap up here, you also say here that our ultimate safety is in our God. Why don't you just continue to encourage the wives out there in terms of just understanding what does this really boil down to? In its essence, what is boundaries really all about in the long run?
Yes. I just encourage you to keep in mind, because even as we talk about boundaries and we say, we need to set boundaries so that we can be safe. Well, ultimately, our safety is really in the Lord, in clinging to Him. He's the greatest boundary setter. So if you want to learn about boundaries, study Him, read His Word, connect with Him. Because He's going to give you what you need, and it's going to be custom designed for your marriage and for your situation. And I honestly look back, Jonathan, to the times that I had to set a stronger boundary, and I have no regrets because God was showing me what to do.
Yeah.
So this is our constant encouragement, right, Ronnie? Connect with the Lord and listen to Him.
Yeah. And this is actually, again, when you think about this on the large scale of what boundaries is really all about, this is not simply a podcast that can only benefit a wife, right? Because guess what we are going to tell guys out there? You need a similar kind of self-care journey that recognizes, listen, the things that you were doing in all of your acting out behaviors, that was not honoring yourself. That was not showing dignity to your own being. Certainly it wasn't showing honor and dignity to your wife. So this is a practice, I think, this whole idea of boundaries that is beneficial for every single person. Because this idea that our ultimate safety is in our God is true for every believer. So I want to just kind of broaden it out as we close, that for the men that are listening out there, hey, this don't turn off your ears. This is for you as well. Well, Ronnie, we are grateful for you being here. Any closing comments that you might have for our listeners before we wrap up?
Well, Jonathan, I would just have to say thank you for you and your ministry. It's been a very important part of our recovery journey, and I'm just so happy to be a part of that ministry as a volunteer. It's great to be with you.
Thank you. That blesses me, and we are definitely blessed by your service to these wives through the care groups, and we just pray that continues and expands out. So, Gigi and Ronnie, thank you both so much for being with us here. And listeners, I want to let you know that if you want to get more information about the care groups and just the resources for wives, please go to wivescare.com. We've got it up on the screen there, or if you're listening, just go to wivescare.com. And there's information about the upcoming groups. Again, there's just a few spots left, so if you're wanting to do the care groups, make sure you get in on that. And there's also other resources on that web page. And of course, if you want to learn more about Pure Sex Radio and get plugged in with us, just go to puresexradio.com, and you can also follow us on Twitter at Pure Sex Radio. And until next time, we will look forward to having you back. Take care, everybody.